Thanks for clicking. China's massive protests against zero COVID dominated pretty much all China headlines this week, as thousands of Chinese took to the streets to protest the ongoing zero COVID lockdowns. Stocks plunged on the news of the protest as many worried that not only zero COVID, but also the protest would put even more pressure on the supply chains and thus the inflation rate, and ergo our interest rates going forward. The protest called for the resignation of President Xi Jinping, who was just recently appointed for a third term as president.
Well, that's not going to happen.
Meanwhile, the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, announced it would be cutting the reserve requirement ratio, the amount of money that Chinese banks have to keep in reserve, in what analysts are calling a major policy shift. So what I want to do today is go over the protests that are spreading throughout China and the options available to President Xi Jinping. Then we'll discuss the PBOC's RRR cut and the apparent about-face on the part of China towards its inflation policy. As we talked about before on this channel, the current problems with inflation being faced by the West will be heavily impacted by what happens in China, and as such, we'll continue to monitor China's real estate crisis and its economy on this channel every Friday. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into these protests. As mentioned, protests erupted in China over the past week in a relatively rare demonstration of public dissent, as the population grows increasingly restless with China's zero-COVID policies. Global markets fell on the news of the protests as concerns grew not only about the future of the Chinese economy due to zero COVID, but also due to increasing dissent on the part of the Chinese population. Beijing moved very quickly to clamp down on the protests, as Beijing does, with police moving very quickly to crack down on protesters, and university students were sent home in an effort to quell the emerging dissent.
Okay?
And I wanted to focus on these protests this week, as what the regime does going forward will have a big impact not only on the Chinese economy, but also on the global economy as well. On the one hand, backing down to these protesters and loosening COVID restrictions could have real long-term consequences for the Chinese economy. Mark Williams, an economist with Capital Economics, says that there is a real concern on behalf of the regime that easing restrictions on the densely populated country could lead to a major upsurge in infections, overwhelming the healthcare system, which would, in fact, lead to another widespread lockdown. And Beijing has been strident in its support for zero COVID and is not going to want to be seen backing down to these protesters. But mass protests, mass disruption in China is going to have a major effect not only on the Chinese economy, but on the global economy as well. Massive crackdowns on popular dissent can and do have unintended consequences, especially, and this is key, when the regime is not delivering the goods. And with China's economy dragging on zero COVID and youth unemployment sitting at 20%, the Chinese regime has definitely not been delivering the goods to its population for the past year. So on the one hand, Beijing can back down to these protesters, open up, which could cause major lockdowns in the future if COVID is allowed to spread. But on the other hand, cracking down on the population and cracking down hard when the regime is already facing major economic problems is not a great choice either.
I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do.
Beijing, thus far, has chosen a mixed approach. While police are spreading across the country to quell the protests, China is lifting some of the restrictions on zero COVID. Whether or not this will work to quell these protests, especially with Beijing not delivering on the economy, remains to be seen. However, the PBOC, the Chinese central bank, made another effort to re-stimulate the economy this week, announcing another RRR cut, which will inject another $70 billion into the economy.
Great idea, Joey. Great idea.
While the PBOC had warned of potential inflation just a few weeks ago, clearly the downturn in the economy has shifted the priorities for Beijing as it attempts to not only recover from its real estate crisis, but also to quell the protests. Indeed, Beijing is probably acutely aware that it hasn't been delivering the goods, especially amid the rising social tension. There's going to be a lot of pressure for Beijing to start delivering those goods, start getting those goods out to the population. So in a major shift from what we've seen over the past few months, Beijing is no longer so much worried about keeping inflation under control. Rather, it's worried about keeping its population under control, getting the economy back up and running again. Unlike here in the West, where our governments say what you want about them, our government's legitimacy rests on elections. In China, which doesn't have elections, the legitimacy of the regime rests on the regime's ability to deliver economic growth, to deliver the goods. And China has been failing on that legitimacy, and the population is starting to show it. After a year-long real estate crisis, lockdowns, mortgage boycotts, and a slowing economy, the Chinese people appear to be voicing their displeasure with Xi's regime, which Beijing hasn't seen in a long time. We'll obviously continue to track China's economy and how it deals with these protests and zero COVID on this channel every Friday. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.